Open the door, Evelyn! You'd rather stand guard over an idiot than get into my bed?
No! Let go of me! James, help me!
Stay away from my woman. What are you...
The entire village mocked me for marrying a giant who couldn't even string a coherent sentence together, until the moment a bully tore at my clothes, and my simple-minded husband transformed into a god in the blink of an eye. Open up, Evelyn. You'd rather have an idiot than share my bed? Silas, the bully, kicked my wooden door to splinters and lunged at me, a sinister grin twisting his face. I squeezed my eyes shut and screamed in despair, yet the humiliation I dreaded never came. Instead, the air around me suddenly turned frigid, cold enough to freeze solid. I opened my eyes to see James, the very man who usually wouldn't dare utter a single word of defiance, clamping a death grip around the bully's throat, effortlessly hoisting the 200-pound brute into the air as if he were nothing more than a piece of trash. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The biting winter wind tore relentlessly through Evelyn's threadbare shawl. It carried the bitter, metallic scent of approaching snow and deep frost. Hunger had cruelly hollowed her delicate cheeks over the past month. Yet, starvation could not erase her striking, undeniable beauty. She stood shivering in the muddy town square of Oakhaven. She clutched a stale, hard half-loaf of bread to her chest like a priceless treasure. This pathetic scrap of food was her literal bride price. It was a miserable trade for her entire life and freedom. The desperate village elder had arranged the match to spare the town another starving mouth. Today, Evelyn was being married off to the village simpleton. The harsh, cruel locals simply called him James. He sat motionless in the freezing mud by the stone church steps. James was staring blankly at his own large, dirt-caked hands. Most men in this dying village were hardened, vicious, and cruel. James, however, was just perpetually, eerily quiet. He was a towering mountain of a man, possessing incredibly broad shoulders. A thick mop of unkempt, golden-brown hair fell over his face. He had been found wandering aimlessly in the treacherous northern woods 3 moons ago. His memory had been completely wiped clean by some unknown trauma. Evelyn stepped closer to him, her heart hammering wildly against her fragile ribs. She fully expected to see disgust or mocking pity from the gathering onlookers. Instead, she only felt the painful, gnawing emptiness in her stomach demanding survival at any cost. "Stand up, James," the village priest ordered with a sharp, disdainful sneer. The massive man visibly flinched at the harsh tone. His giant frame shrank inward as if he were a deeply frightened child. Evelyn felt a sudden, unexpected pang of deep empathy for this gentle, broken giant. She reached out her pale, trembling hand toward his massive form. "It is all right," she whispered in a remarkably soft, soothing voice. James slowly, hesitantly lifted his heavy head to look at her. For a microscopic fraction of a second, the vacant, foolish look in his eyes vanished completely. His irises were a piercing, striking icy blue. They seemed to hold the raw, terrifying ferocity of a wild winter storm. A sudden flicker of dangerous, predatory gold flared deep within his pupils. Evelyn's breath caught sharply in her freezing throat. That was absolutely not the helpless gaze of a broken, mindless fool. It was the intensely primal, calculating stare of an apex predator. But just as quickly as it appeared, the terrifying storm passed. The dull, empty, harmless smile instantly returned to his exceptionally handsome face. He reached out and took her fragile hand in his massive, rough palm. His grip was surprisingly gentle, yet possessed an impossible, underlying strength. The surrounding villagers laughed loudly, mocking the union of the starving beauty and the towering idiot. They simply did not know the dark, bloody truth of the northern woods. They did not know that the supreme ruler of the wolves had been missing for exactly 3 moons. And Evelyn, desperate just to survive until tomorrow, was completely oblivious. She had no idea she had just permanently bound her mortal soul to the most lethal creature in the entire realm. Evelyn led James to her small, decaying cottage at the very edge of the woods. The rotten wooden door creaked loudly against the freezing, merciless wind. Inside, the stone hearth was completely cold, and thick darkness swallowed the tiny room. She gently set her hard-earned half-loaf of bread on the scarred wooden table. Her empty stomach twisted again with a painful, incredibly familiar ache. She carefully broke the small scrap of food into 2 unequal pieces. She pushed the significantly larger half toward the giant man sitting on the dirt floor. James stared at the bread, then looked up at Evelyn through his tangled, golden-brown hair. "Eat, James," she said softly, rubbing her freezing arms for a bit of warmth. He grabbed the dry bread with his massive, dirt-stained fingers and began to eat ravenously. Evelyn sat on the edge of her creaking mattress, chewing her tiny portion slowly to make it last. She watched his massive silhouette in the dim, pale moonlight filtering through the cracked window. He looked entirely harmless now, chewing happily like a perfectly innocent, simple child. Suddenly, a heavy, violent kick rattled the fragile wooden door. Evelyn froze instantly, the blood turning to pure ice in her veins. It was Silas, the village butcher's ruthless son, who had aggressively hunted her for months. "Open the door, Evelyn, I know you are in there with your idiot husband," Silas yelled from outside. He kicked the door once more, the rotten iron latch snapping instantly under the force. Silas stepped heavily into the cottage, smelling strongly of cheap ale and sour sweat. He looked at Evelyn with greedy, predatory eyes, completely ignoring the silent giant in the dark corner. "You chose a mindless fool over me just to avoid my bed," Silas sneered, stepping closer to her. Evelyn backed away in terror until her spine hit the freezing stone wall. Silas reached out a rough, brutal hand to grab her pale, trembling shoulder. In the dark corner, James suddenly stood up, his towering frame completely blocking the moonlight. The air inside the small room instantly grew suffocatingly heavy and deathly still. Silas did not even have the time to turn around before a massive hand gripped his throat. With effortless, terrifying physical strength, James lifted the heavy man entirely off the floor. Silas gasped frantically, his face turning a dark, panicked purple as his legs kicked wildly in the air. James threw him across the dark room like a piece of worthless, discarded rag. Silas crashed heavily into the stone hearth, groaning in absolute, bone-shattering agony. James then stumbled backward very clumsily, tripping over a wooden stool and crashing to the floor. He began to whine softly, tightly clapping his large hands over his ears as if frightened by the noise. Silas scrambled to his feet, utterly terrified, bleeding from his forehead, and completely humiliated. He fled into the freezing night, screaming frantically about dark curses and forest demons. Evelyn rushed over to James, her own heart pounding frantically against her fragile ribs. She gently pulled his massive hands away from his face to carefully check for any injuries. James looked straight up at her, his icy blue eyes perfectly clear and intensely, deeply focused. Deep within his pupils, that mysterious, predatory gold light burned brighter than ever before. He leaned his heavy head gently against her soft shoulder, exhaling a deep, contented sigh. Evelyn held the gentle giant tightly, completely unaware that she had just been claimed by a king. The morning sun brought no warmth to the frozen village of Oakhaven. Instead, it brought the bitter consequence of Silas's bruised ego. The greedy village elders officially banned Evelyn from the communal food rations. They falsely claimed her new husband was a dangerous, unpredictable beast. Evelyn's empty stomach twisted with a sharp, agonizing pain. She looked at the tall man sitting quietly by the cold stone hearth. James was carefully stacking small wooden blocks, playing like an innocent toddler. He possessed the sharp, chiseled European features of northern royalty, completely wasted on a fool. "We must go to the woods, James," she whispered softly with trembling lips. "We will surely starve to death if we stay inside this cabin." The northern woods were notoriously deadly during the harsh winter months. Vicious predators and deep snowdrifts claimed many brave, experienced hunters. But sheer desperation forced Evelyn out into the biting, merciless wind. James followed obediently behind her, his heavy boots crunching in the deep snow. He subtly used his broad chest to block the freezing gusts from hitting her fragile frame. They wandered for hours among the towering, ancient pine trees. Evelyn found nothing but frozen, dead roots and empty rabbit snares. Her frail body began to shake violently under the plummeting temperature. Her vision suddenly blurred, and she collapsed to her freezing knees in the thick snow. "I am so sorry, James," she cried out in bitter, total defeat. She fully expected the gentle giant to sit beside her and weep in fear. But when she weakly lifted her heavy head, James was completely gone. Panic instantly flooded her frozen veins like liquid ice. "James," she screamed desperately into the silent, white wilderness. She forced her exhausted body up and followed his deep footprints. The heavy tracks led deeper into the shadowed, forbidden territory of the forest. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks, completely breathless. James was standing calmly in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. At his large feet lay a freshly killed, enormous winter stag. It was a magnificent beast, providing enough precious meat to last them for months. James was sitting in the snow, clapping his large hands with a foolish, innocent grin. "Found it," he cheered loudly, pointing at the huge carcass like a child finding a lost toy. Evelyn rushed forward, completely stunned by this impossible, life-saving miracle. There was absolutely no blood on James's hands, nor any weapon in sight. She did not notice the gigantic, terrifying paw prints circling the snowy clearing. She did not see the dozen glowing eyes watching them from the dark tree line. The wild wolves of the north had brought their best kill to their true master. They bowed silently in the shadows to the missing Duke of the Untamed Territories. Evelyn simply hugged James tightly, weeping hot tears of pure joy and relief. She truly believed the heavens had finally shown her a tiny shred of mercy. She still did not realize her simple-minded husband secretly commanded the deadliest army in the world. The bitter morning wind whipped across the bustling village square of Oakhaven. Evelyn dragged a heavy wooden sled loaded with fresh, premium venison. She intended to trade the rich meat for warm blankets and a sturdy iron pot. The sight of such magnificent food instantly stopped the starving villagers in their tracks. Hungry eyes followed her every move with a mix of awe and dark, festering jealousy. No one in this decaying town had seen such a massive winter stag in years. Silas pushed his way through the gathering crowd, his face still bruised and swollen. He glared at Evelyn, his pride deeply wounded from the previous night's humiliation. 3 equally cruel men flanked him, blocking Evelyn's path to the merchant's stalls. Where did a fragile little girl get such a beast? Silas demanded loudly. He stepped dangerously close, his breath reeking of cheap, sour wine. Her idiot husband is a cursed monster, dragging dark magic into our homes. He aggressively reached out to snatch the sled rope from Evelyn's frozen hands. Evelyn stood her ground firmly, refusing to let the local bully steal her survival. "Leave us alone, Silas, or the magistrate will hear of this," she warned bravely. The village men simply laughed at her desperate, empty threat. Silas raised his heavy fist, ready to strike the beautiful, defiant woman. Suddenly, a chaotic, terrifying sound echoed from the top of the steep cobbled street. A heavily loaded merchant wagon had snapped its iron brake line. Two massive draft horses panicked, charging wildly down the hill directly toward the crowd. Screams erupted as villagers scattered frantically into the muddy snowbanks. Evelyn froze in sheer terror, the runaway wagon barreling straight for her. She closed her eyes tightly, bracing for a fatal, crushing impact. Instead, she felt a sudden rush of warm, powerful air brush past her shoulder. James had silently moved from the edge of the square to stand right in front of her. The towering giant simply raised one bare, dirt-stained hand toward the charging beasts. He did not brace his legs, nor did he show an ounce of human fear. His palm casually met the foaming muzzle of the lead draft horse. Thousands of pounds of deadly momentum vanished into thin air in an instant. The massive wooden wagon groaned violently but stopped dead in its tracks. The two terrified horses immediately dropped to their knees, trembling uncontrollably. They pressed their heads into the freezing mud, submitting to an unseen, absolute authority. Total, suffocating silence fell over the entire village square. Every single person stared at the simpleton in absolute, trembling disbelief. James quickly dropped his hand and began to cry, pretending the loud noise had scared him. He hid behind Evelyn's small frame, shaking like a frightened, helpless child. But Silas had seen the terrifying, predatory gold flash in the giant's icy blue eyes. The bully stumbled backward, utterly terrified, and ran away without looking back. No one dared to step near Evelyn or her sled of meat ever again. She sold the venison for triple its worth, securing their survival for the winter. She smiled warmly at her foolish husband, completely unaware of his supreme, royal power. The crackling fire finally brought real, comforting warmth to the decaying cottage. Evelyn carefully heated fresh snow in her newly traded iron pot. She intended to wash the freezing, hardened mud from her giant husband. The tiny, isolated cabin finally felt like a genuine, safe sanctuary. She gently pulled the torn, filthy tunic over James's massive shoulders. Evelyn gasped softly, instantly dropping the warm, wet cloth onto the wooden floor. Beneath the thick layers of dirt was a body sculpted from pale, hard marble. His broad chest and ridged stomach belonged to an elite, highly trained warrior. More shocking were the countless silver scars crisscrossing his flawless pale skin. Jagged claw marks and deep blade wounds painted a violent, terrifying history. No simple village idiot could ever survive such brutal, systematic physical trauma. He possessed the undeniable, magnificent anatomy of a high-born European warlord. James sat perfectly still, letting her trembling fingers trace a massive scar across his ribs. His skin was burning hot to the touch, radiating an intense, inhuman heat. "Who hurt you so badly, James?" she whispered, her voice breaking with deep sorrow. He looked down at her fragile hands, his icy blue eyes darkening significantly. For a fleeting moment, an ancient, weary sadness shadowed his striking face. Then, the dangerous, predatory gold ring flared deep within his pupils once again. He gently reached out and wiped a stray, hot tear from Evelyn's pale cheek. His massive thumb was incredibly tender against her soft, delicate skin. A sudden, overwhelming wave of heat rushed straight to her chest and cheeks. Her heart pounded frantically like a trapped bird inside her small, fragile ribs. She felt an inexplicable, undeniable bond pulling her soul toward this silent giant. He was a broken monster to the ignorant world, but he was her absolute protector. Outside the warm cottage, the harsh winter wind began to howl violently again. A heavy, ominous thud of armored boots echoed at the very edge of Oakhaven. 3 towering men in dark, heavy plate armor marched through the deep snowdrifts. Their frozen steel shields bore the terrifying silver crest of the Northern Duchy. They were elite, ruthless trackers hunting for the supreme ruler of the wilds. The missing Duke of the North was finally within their deadly, unyielding grasp. They stopped an old, trembling villager near the snow-covered merchant square. "We seek a giant of a man with golden brown hair," the lead knight growled darkly. The terrified villager immediately pointed a shaking finger toward Evelyn's isolated cabin. The fragile wooden door of the cottage exploded inward with a deafening crash. 3 towering knights in thick steel plate armor stormed into the tiny room. The freezing winter wind howled through the broken doorway behind them. They immediately locked their cruel eyes onto the giant sitting by the fire. A triumphant, wicked smile twisted the face of the lead tracker. "We finally found you, our wretched, missing duke," he spat venomously. He drew a polished broadsword, its sharp edge gleaming in the dim firelight. "The new ruler of the Northern Duchy sends his absolute regards." Evelyn did not even pause to consider her own mortal vulnerability. She threw her small, striking figure directly in front of the imposing man. She spread her arms wide, desperately shielding her supposedly foolish husband. "Leave him alone," she screamed, her voice shaking but full of fierce resolve. The lead knight laughed darkly, raising his weapon without a shred of mercy. "Then die first, peasant woman," he sneered, swinging the blade downward. Evelyn closed her eyes tight, fully prepared to pay the ultimate price for love. But the fatal, crushing blow she expected never actually arrived. A sudden, violent gust of wind ripped through the confined space of the cabin. She heard a sickening, wet crunch of shattering bone and twisting metal. She opened her eyes to a scene of absolute, incomprehensible nightmare. James was no longer sitting helplessly by the warm stone hearth. He had moved faster than any human I could possibly track or comprehend. One of his large, pale hands was wrapped completely around the knight's steel-clad throat. The reinforced chest plate buckled and cracked like fragile glass under his grip. With a careless, brutal flick of his wrist, James snapped the attacker's neck instantly. The lifeless body of the elite warrior dropped heavily to the wooden floor. The remaining 2 soldiers froze in sheer, paralyzing terror at the impossible sight. This was not the broken, wandering idiot they had been promised by their spies. This was the apex predator of the North, the undisputed lord of the wild. Before they could even raise their shields, James lunged forward like a striking serpent. He possessed the raw, devastating power of a living, breathing god of war. He drove his fist straight through the thick iron defense of the second knight. The third man turned to flee, but a hurled wooden stool crushed his skull from behind. Silence descended upon the bloody cabin, broken only by the crackling fire. Evelyn stood completely paralyzed, trembling violently at the horrific carnage before her. James stood amidst the fresh blood, his icy blue eyes glowing with feral gold. He slowly turned his towering frame toward his terrified, beautiful young wife. The murderous, suffocating aura surrounding him suddenly vanished into thin air. He dropped heavily to his knees, burying his face into her soft, trembling stomach. "Loud noise," he whimpered pitifully, wrapping his strong arms around her waist. He shook violently, perfectly mimicking the profound terror of a helpless child. Evelyn hesitantly stroked his golden brown hair, her mind entirely blank with shock. She was comforting a man who had just effortlessly slaughtered 3 elite soldiers. The blood-soaked cottage was no longer a safe haven for anyone. Evelyn knew the ruthless trackers of the false ruler would soon return in greater numbers. She grabbed her thin woolen cloak and pulled James into the freezing, merciless night. They fled deep into the unforgiving, snow-locked heart of the northern mountains. The brutal, howling blizzard erased their frantic footprints almost instantly. James stumbled along behind her, clutching her small hand like a terrified, lost child. Yet, his towering, magnificent frame effortlessly shielded her from the deadly wind. His striking, chiseled European jawline was set in an unreadable, stony expression. As they crossed a frozen black river, the true strangeness finally began to unfold. A massive, starving snow bear emerged slowly from the dark, jagged rocks. Evelyn froze in sheer panic, bracing herself for a swift and brutal death. Instead, the massive predator took one single look at the giant man standing beside her. The deadly beast let out a pathetic, trembling whimper of absolute terror. It immediately pressed its massive belly deep into the freezing, hard snow. The bear crawled backward into the shadows, completely and utterly submitting to them. Evelyn's breath caught sharply in her freezing, raw throat. She turned to look at James, her mind spinning with terrifying, impossible questions. He simply tilted his handsome head, offering her a sweet, vacantly innocent smile. But the piercing, icy blue of his eyes told a vastly different, much darker story. Hours later, a heavily armed patrol of rebel cavalry blocked the narrow mountain pass. 5 armored soldiers drew their polished steel swords, shouting violent threats. Before the treacherous soldiers could even spur their massive war horses forward, disaster struck. The highly trained military beasts suddenly panicked in absolute, blind horror. They reared up violently, completely ignoring their riders' desperate, angry commands. The wild horses threw the heavily armored men directly off the sheer, deadly cliff edge. The agonizing screams of the rebels faded quickly into the deep, dark abyss below. The majestic horses then bowed their heavy heads low toward James before galloping away. Evelyn stood shivering violently, and it was no longer just from the freezing cold. She stared blankly at the towering, gorgeous man she called her simpleton husband. No mere mortal commanded the absolute obedience of both starving beast and trained warhorse. The staggering truth was finally crashing down upon her fragile, weary mind. She had not saved a helpless, broken fool from the cruel, unforgiving village. She had married a living, breathing god of the untamed northern territories. Deep within James's mind, the heavy iron chains binding his memories were violently shattering. The glorious, bloody history of the true Duke was roaring fiercely back to life. The sleeping tyrant of the north was finally opening his eyes in the dark. The howling blizzard suddenly ceased as if commanded by an unseen, terrifying force. A massive army of rebel soldiers completely blocked the treacherous mountain path ahead. Hundreds of heavily armored men raised their polished steel swords toward the grey sky. The false, usurping ruler had sent his entire royal guard to finish the hunt. Evelyn stumbled backward, her fragile body trembling from sheer exhaustion and absolute terror. There was absolutely no escape from this towering, impenetrable wall of cold steel. She tightly gripped James's massive hand, preparing for their inevitable, violent end. But the giant man beside her did not cower or whimper this time. He slowly, deliberately pulled his large hand away from her delicate, freezing fingers. James stepped directly in front of Evelyn, completely shielding her from the vast army. His broad, powerful shoulders rolled back, instantly discarding the pathetic slump of a simpleton. His spine straightened completely, revealing his true, terrifying, and magnificent height. The vacant, foolish mask melted entirely away from his chiseled, flawless European features. His icy blue eyes turned completely gold, radiating a lethal, blinding, and ancient authority. The arrogant rebel commander laughed loudly, completely oblivious to the awakening nightmare. "Kill the idiot and bring me the woman," the commander ordered his men viciously. A deafening, inhuman roar suddenly erupted from deep within James's broad chest. It was not a human sound, but the terrifying, blood-curdling war cry of an apex predator. The dark northern woods immediately answered his violent, earth-shattering call. Hundreds of massive winter wolves charged fiercely out from the shadowed, snowy tree line. They did not attack the unarmed woman, but leaped savagely upon the heavily armored soldiers. James did not just stand back and watch the bloody, chaotic carnage unfold. He moved like a dark, vengeful phantom directly through the falling white snow. He tore through solid iron shields and thick steel chest plates with his bare hands. His raw physical power was absolute, crushing grown men like dry, brittle winter twigs. The grand rebel army broke and scattered in less than a single, incredibly bloody minute. The surviving soldiers dropped their heavy weapons and fell to their trembling knees. They wept openly and begged for mercy from the undisputed, terrifying ruler of the North. James, the long-missing Duke, stood completely victorious amidst the ruined, silent battlefield. The violent golden fire in his eyes slowly faded back to a piercing, crystal-clear blue. He turned his majestic, blood-spattered frame back toward his stunned, speechless wife. He did not drop to his knees or pretend to be frightened by the battlefield noise. He approached her with the slow, deliberate, and undeniable grace of a conquering monarch. Evelyn held her breath, staring up at the terrifying, breathtakingly beautiful stranger. He gently cupped her pale, freezing face with his massive, blood-stained hands. "You bravely protected a helpless fool," his voice rumbled, deep and impossibly smooth. "Now, a duke shall fiercely protect you for the rest of your mortal days." The violent winter storm finally yielded to a brilliantly clear, starlit night. James stood incredibly tall amidst the silent, frozen battlefield. His enemies were completely vanquished, their treachery buried under the deep snow. He gently wrapped his own heavy, warm woolen cloak around Evelyn's trembling shoulders. The freezing wind could no longer touch her fragile, exhausted body. He lifted her effortlessly into his strong, protective arms like a precious treasure. Evelyn rested her weary head against his broad, armor-clad chest. She listened to the steady, powerful beating of his ancient, royal heart. A deafening, triumphant howl suddenly erupted from the surrounding pine forest. The majestic winter wolves were singing a wild, glorious song for their returning master. A magnificent, black iron carriage emerged slowly from the shadowy tree line. It was pulled by four massive, silver-maned beasts that bowed low as they approached. James carefully placed Evelyn inside the warm, luxurious interior of the royal transport. He climbed in beside her, his towering frame filling the comfortable space. The grand carriage moved swiftly through the unforgiving northern mountains. They traveled far beyond the miserable, starving village of Oakhaven. Evelyn realized she would never suffer from biting hunger or bitter cold ever again. They soon arrived at the towering, ancient stone gates of Silver Peak Keep. It was the legendary, impenetrable fortress of the true Northern Duchy. Hundreds of loyal knights and terrified nobles were already waiting in the grand courtyard. They immediately dropped to their knees upon seeing the terrifying, familiar golden eyes of their lord. James ignored the kneeling lords and simply held out his large hand to Evelyn. He led his beautiful, young wife up the steep, icy steps toward the high throne. The great hall was illuminated by thousands of bright, flickering candles. He guided her to a magnificent seat carved entirely from solid white marble. "This is your home now, my brave and beautiful wife," James rumbled softly. He gently brushed a soft lock of dark hair from her flushed cheek. Evelyn looked at the powerful, gorgeous man who had once played the village simpleton. She remembered the broken, starving giant who had humbly eaten her stale bread. He had traded his vacant, foolish mask for the absolute, ruthless authority of a sovereign. Yet, the deep, burning devotion in his icy blue eyes had never once changed. He slowly knelt before her, right in front of his entire, stunned court. The supreme, undisputed ruler of the North bowed his heavy head to a mortal woman. He pressed a tender, searing kiss to the delicate back of her pale hand. "I pledge my eternal soul and my vast kingdom to you, Evelyn," he vowed loudly. The royal court erupted into a roaring, thunderous cheer that shook the very foundations. Evelyn smiled warmly, a single tear of pure, absolute joy falling from her eye. She had married a fool simply to escape starvation on a freezing winter night. She had unknowingly captured the fiercely loyal heart of the greatest duke in the realm. The harsh, brutal winter outside was finally over for her forever. Her golden era of love and absolute safety had just